Switching now to solar thermal systems. These systems collect usable heat and turn it into electricity. So solar power has always been our ultimate energy source. This solar energy drives winds and the hydraulic cycle on Earth. And of course, the sun has produced all biomass, including fossil fuels and our food. The exception being life that lives at the bottom of the sea where there is no sunlight. So really, we lean on the sun for a whole lot of energy already. The average amount of solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface is about 10,000 times all the commercial energy that is used in a year. So by and large, we're being bombarded with more solar energy than we could ever possibly use. The problem is just harnessing and holding that heat for our purposes. Of course, that amount of solar radiation, it varies geographically, whether you're at the equator, at the poles, but solar energy is sufficient for economical production, even at high latitudes. So here we have a map of the US solar resources. This is from the National Renewable Energy Resource Laboratory, with warmer colors showing the amount of kilowatt hours per meter squared per day that could be generated through solar means alone. So here out west, of course, where we have a bunch of arid regions, that's where we have the largest capacity, and the lowest capacity seems to be in the northeast here. So these concentrating solar power systems are where we get our electricity from heat. These solar thermal systems can make steam and run a turbine, all to convert that heat into electrical energy. It is called CSP, and CSPs often use long trough-shaped parabolic mirrors to reflect and concentrate sunlight on a central tube that contains a heat-absorbing fluid. So this is an example of a CSP here. It is trough-shaped, it's like a bowl, and all of these mirrors are focusing light on one central probe here, which contains a heat-absorbing fluid. As you can imagine, with all of these mirrors concentrating high amounts of solar irradiance, they can reach extremely high temperatures. And so this fluid that concentrates here, getting very, very, very hot, it passes through a heat exchanger where it heats water and generates steam. So heat from the transfer fluid can also be stored in a medium, including molten salt, for later use. This allows the system to continue to generate electricity even when the sun is not shining, including nighttime and cloudy days. So the CSP system is extremely attractive to utilities because installations are large and often hundreds of megawatts. The system is a way to produce solar energy on a scale that makes economic sense to investors. The problem lies with acquiring land and permits because often that process is slow and expensive. But as you can imagine, these plans are controversial. There is the benefit of helping free us from fossil fuels, but they can sometimes threaten rare or endangered species, including the desert tortoise, whose habitat is already reduced by development in the desert. So again, there's a lot of pros and cons to weigh with these alternative energy sources. So let's talk about solar capture. The main way to capture solar energy is through photovoltaic cells. They capture solar energy and convert it directly to electrical current. And this happens in these panels here that have those photovoltaic cells. And they are in these cells separating electrons from their parent atoms and accelerating them across one-way electrostatic barrier that's formed by the junction between two types of conductor material here. So in this diagram, we have photons from the sun that are striking the panel surface that excites the electrons. Those electrons are then going to move from this top layer to the next layer beneath it, passing through this junction point. A shortage of electrons results in the surface layer, while an excess of electrons develop in the lower layer here. The wires that connect the two layers allow the electrons to return to the surface layer, and this return creates an electrical current. So the electrons pass from the top through the junction to the bottom. It creates a current here, and then is returned back to the top layer. So these layers are composed of two different materials. The N-type layer is phosphorus enriched, and the P-type layer is boron enriched. N-type is negative type, while P-type stands for positive type. And the difference in charge between these two creates that electrical current. So here are just images of photovoltaic cells and ways to capture solar energy. Here we have a base load power facility. Here in B, we have these really thin, flexible film solar tiles that could be added to rooftops. And then finally, in C, we have those more familiar rooftop solar arrays. So all of this to showcase that solar photovoltaic energy is highly versatile and can be used in a variety of dispersed settings, ranging from industrial to commercial and personal use. Another type of alternative energy source that's gaining in attention is biomass and biofuels. For more than 1 billion people in developing countries, burning plant materials or plant biomass remains the principal energy source for heating and for cooking. An estimated 1,500 cubed meters of fuel wood is gathered each year globally. This amounts to half of all of the wood harvested. So by and large, humans already know how to burn wood for fuel. So the attempts now are to harness that power and blow it up on a large scale. Biofuels is our attempt to use biomass to generate usable liquid fuel for vehicles. And it has so far had mixed results on a global scale. For example, China and Brazil, the biofuel industry is booming. But in the United States, it's pretty mixed. And part of the issue here in the US is that the land used to generate the biomass to create the fuel is hard to acquire, it's hard to get permitting, and of course, there are environmental ramifications. There have been a number of proposed techniques to extract sugars from cellulosic materials, and so the technology is still currently being researched and developed by industry leaders like BP and Exxon. But the question is, could algae be a hope for the future? And so researchers right now are finding different strains of algae that can grow rapidly under different types of environmental stresses, including high salt conditions, hot conditions, and understanding how much oil or lipids could be potentially extracted from those algae and converted into biofuels. Algal growth facilities could be placed next to conventional power plants. This is where the most intriguing benefits lie. So remember, we were talking about cogeneration, using the waste product of one thing and converting that into energy. And so these conventional power plants that are giving off a whole bunch of CO2 as part of their process through burning either fossil fuels or biomass, it could be captured and used for algal growth. They need carbon dioxide to build biomass. So this would create a marvelous closed system of energy cogeneration. Another thing to consider is that methane from biomass is pretty efficient. Just about any organic waste, from sewage to manure, it could be used to produce methane. And as you remember, methane is a large component of natural gas. This natural gas, this methane, is produced when anaerobic microbes digest organic matter. They do this in an oxygen-free space. So methane is relatively efficient and clean burning. It's easily oxidized and it produces at the same time CO2 and water vapor. And so despite the greenhouse potential of methane itself, methane has a natural advantage over coal. And that is because when it's burned to produce electricity, it only produces 1/3 to 1/2 as much CO2 compared to burning coal. So this reduction in CO2 output is responsible for much of the decrease in US greenhouse gas emissions that have taken place in recent years. The lower greenhouse gas emissions of natural gas compared to coal comes from two different effects. When methane burns, it's burned efficiently. The other effect comes from the nature of modern electrical generator technology. The most efficient combined cycle natural gas power plants can turn about 60% of the produced thermal energy into electricity. When we compare that 60% associated with methane burning compared to coal burning, we see that coal burning only operates at about 43% efficiency. Therefore, you don't have to burn as much methane as you would coal in order to get the same amount of energy. There's also an additional form of alternative energy called geothermal heat. And all of this comes from Earth's internal temperature. And countries like Iceland have harnessed Earth's internal temperature to provide a useful source of energy for its inhabitants. And so this entire thing is called geothermal energy. It's expressed in forms of hot springs at the surface, geysers, and fumaroles. It's really, really important in Iceland because Iceland sits at a mid-ocean ridge, and therefore all of that geothermal heat is rising from deep within the surface and expressing itself at the surface here. These geothermal energy plants can cut heating and cooling costs by half in many areas. And they can do this because geothermal heat pumps can heat and cool efficiently. So they're not all about heating. So the pumping fluids through deeply buried pipes can exchange temperature with the soil to efficiently heat or cool a home. The question becomes, how do we store this energy? And so fuel cells have been leaned on for the storing of energy. All fuel cells consist of a positive electrode, which is called the cathode, and a negative electrode, which is called the anode. This is an image here of the Long Island Power Authority, which has installed 75 stationary fuel cells to provide reliable backup power. It's important not only to generate the power, but also to store it when energy demands are extremely high. So in these fuel cells, the cathode and the anode are separated by an electrolyte, which is a name for a material that allows the passage of charged atoms, also called ions. But importantly, it is impermeable to electrons. So in that way, these fuel cells are able to effectively store generated energy. So this begs the question, what is our energy future? Could we get all of our electricity from renewable, environmentally friendly sources? There are several academics who say, yes, we absolutely can. We've looked at the data and it is within the realm of possibility. And so these scientists here, Mark Jacobson from Stanford and Mark DeLucci from UC Davis, they've calculated that the currently available wind, water, and solar technologies could supply 100% of the world's energy by the year 2030 and completely eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels. So what does this scenario look like for the year 2050? Here we have a large amount of energy from the cogeneration of that energy, also relying on wind sources, solar sources, biomass, nuclear, hydro, and then geothermal. So the question, is there enough clean energy to meet our needs? Yes, there is. And the World Energy Council projects that renewables could provide about 60% of the world's cumulative energy consumption by the year 2030. And to understand a little bit more about how we can transition from fossil fuel reliance to clean energy, please read these pages in your textbook to get you to understand how can we transition to alternative energy. In conclusion, fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas, they remain our dominant energy sources, especially in the United States. But oil, as we know, is being depleted and coal causes environmental damage. Natural gas and methane, they're abundant and cleaner technically than coal, but fracking, the most common method used to extract that natural gas, is environmentally dangerous and it soaks up a lot of water. So that is a problem in addition to the accidental release of that methane to the atmosphere. Nuclear power does not create carbon dioxide when it operates, but the storage of that nuclear waste is a problem. And then finally, rapid innovations in solar, wind, wave power, and other renewable energy sources now make it possible to get all of our energy from clean technologies.